I'm the energy coordinator for the town of Moretown, and I, on behalf of the Moretown Planning Commission and the Energy Committee, wanted to welcome you to this forum on wind energy. I appreciate you all coming out tonight. It's a good turnout. Hopefully we'll have a few more coming in. In terms of just some logistics here, there's bathrooms in this building are on the lower level, so if you go back through that door and down the stairs, in case you're wondering where those are. There's food, of course, hopefully you found that, some snacks and drinks. And there's also a sign-up sheet back there, so if you want additional information from some of the folks that are going to be speaking tonight, you can sign up for that and they can email that to you. I want to introduce the first speaker tonight. His name is Ben Luce, right here. He's a PhD physicist who worked as a renewable energy advocate in New Mexico and is currently an associate professor of physics and sustainability studies at the Department of Natural Sciences at Lyndon State College. Tonight we're going to start off with Ben giving a 30-minute presentation, and then we're going to actually have a panel discussion that Annette Smith is going to lead for us. So I'll introduce the members of that panel when we get to that section of tonight's agenda. So if there's anything else I need to mention, Annette, or did I cover it? So I'll turn it over to Ben. Thank you.
Can you hear me? Pretty well? Okay, I'm going to use the mobile mic here. So I've been giving presentations on this topic for a couple of years, and I usually give a pretty long presentation. I usually take about an hour and a half, and I take questions throughout the whole thing, and that's one thing that stretches it out. Tonight, I'm not going to do that because we're going to try to focus most of the discussion in the panel afterwards. So I'm going to move through what I've got here relatively quickly, and try to hit the main points and not go down into too much of the weeds. We'll leave that to later, to basically allow people to just go where they will with these topics. I bring a certain perspective to this. It's a perspective based on sort of big picture. I'm very interested in how society is going to sort out different renewable energy resources and really try to make a quick transition to renewables. I am a hardcore believer in the threat of climate change. I have been since about the early 90s. I used to work at a national laboratory which had a geophysics institute, and I got a good introduction in about 1994, 93 to what was happening with carbon dioxide concentrations. And so ever since then I've been working a lot on energy and been involved with renewable energy. So I just want to give you some idea of where I'm coming from. I'm not going to get into the climate issue now, just to tell you where my background is. I got very involved in teaching about, researching, working with renewable energy systems in New Mexico, and I eventually got involved in policy advocacy, and I really worked that very hard for over a decade. And the group that I put together and I were able to get through many different incentives for both renewables and efficiency. I mostly mentioned the renewable stuff here. So I have a lot of background in policy development, and we were actually very successful. I was a very strong advocate of utility scale wind in that state. This is a photo of at the ribbon cutting of the first project that was installed in New Mexico based on the policies that we got out. This was a 205 megawatt utility scale wind farm in the eastern plains of New Mexico. And I'm the guy in the strange hat on the right. What I want to do is sort of set the stage by talking about this idea of trying to really compare renewable energy options. My perspective on this is that reducing CO2 or other greenhouse gas emissions significantly is a really daunting task. And I think that our chances of really reducing quickly enough to stave off the worst ravages of climate change is pretty low. And for that reason, I really emphasize that we really need to look very carefully at the technologies. Basically, renewable energy technologies are not created equal. There are lots of differences. There are enormous differences in the potential of different renewable resources, in their costs and cost trends, in their prospects for being improved further, and in their environmental impacts. So, from my perspective, if we're really going to succeed in bringing about a rather enormous change to society and to our energy infrastructure pretty rapidly, we're going to have to look at these kind of things very carefully. We're going to have to make our choices very carefully. And what I perceive widely is that there tends to be, within the advocacy community, within the renewable energy industry, with utility industry, and with quite a few members of the public at large, is sort of an any and all approach, which is, we'll just take all of it. Any project we can get off the ground, any kind of development, we've got to do anything, everything we can do is helpful for this. And I actually have the opposite view. I think that that's a very problematic type of approach. I think we need to look very carefully at this, and that this kind of any and all approach is arguably harmful. So whether or not you agree with me on wind and some other topics that I'll discuss tonight, I would hope that maybe at least that we could agree on that would be something that we could get going as a little more of a serious discussion. The first thing I thought I would talk about on wind is just to take a little look at the kinds of impacts associated with it. The impacts have been sharply downplayed by the industry and by advocates of wind. After many, many years of interacting with this industry and actual projects, I've come around to the point of view that the impacts are actually very serious, and they're particularly serious in the Northeast. There are topographical impacts to the land, blasting and bulldozing, and then associated with those, hydrological impacts that come from creating large impervious surfaces up on mountaintops. There is a significant amount of habitat fragmentation and loss. In Vermont, the one place we've left quite pristine is our mountain ranges. That's where much of our wildlife lives. We've inhabited the valleys quite fully, and building fairly large roads and large projects down mountain ridges really does result in a lot of habitat issues. There are potential impacts to birds and bats. These are sharply downplayed by the industry, but from my point of view, if we really try to develop a lot of this stuff, those impacts become potentially very, very serious. There are impacts to people. There are issues with noise. When I was first advocating in this area, I used to downplay the noise issue. I really believed that noise was an insignificant issue. I have come to a different point of view, especially for people that live relatively close to the projects. And also there are issues, unexplored issues actually, with noise impacts on wildlife. There are some people looking into this now, but not that many. The issue of aesthetic impacts also is very relevant in Vermont. Much of Vermont's economy depends on the aesthetics here. Many people live here because they like the aesthetics. They sacrifice a lot to enjoy those. There is directly or indirectly, much of our economy here depends on ecotourism, and the aesthetics are often considered a shallow issue. People who are concerned about aesthetic impacts are often labeled as NIMBYs, not in my backyarders, and sort of denigrated for that. I sort of have the opposite view on that. I think that when people really value the way the landscape looks, that translates later on into strong environmental valuing and strong environmental protections like Act 250 and things like that. If you take that away, I think the entire ecological protection network that exists in a place like this starts to collapse. We've seen that happen in places like West Virginia, and we don't want it to happen here, I believe. Then there are the impacts that happen to communities. These projects, large-scale wind projects on ridge lines, as a rule, tend to be extremely controversial and divisive. We've seen that over and over in Vermont. A lot of issues associated with that. And then from a larger standpoint, all of these issues and how they play into decisions we make, how they play into how public acceptance of renewable energy evolves over time. is a very serious issue, and there are lots of implications possibly for the effectiveness and public support for renewable energy. If we really alienate a large fraction of the public, even just 5–10%, that could be enough to shift the entire political support for renewables to a minority position and possibly undermine the whole endeavor. All right, some more details on the topographical impacts. One thing people need to understand is these are very large devices. They require a great deal of steel in their support tower, a great deal of cement. They're very heavy, large objects. These things cannot be installed kind of just nestled in among the trees. Installing them is a major kind of undertaking. Moving these things up there require very large trucks and cranes, and the sites have to be cleared and made ready for those vehicles on a permanent basis so that you can do this kind of construction. The physics just doesn't work unless you do that. So you need what I would call industrial strength roads. Sometimes people talk about, well, we've got logging here, we've got logging roads. The kind of roads that we're talking about here are a whole different scale. They're closer to interstate highways in terms of their level of support and width and whatnot. And so this translates into lots of bulldozing and blasting. So here are some photos. The picture on the left shows a typical truck carrying a tower. These things have a lot of trouble, sometimes even getting up fairly narrow grade or fairly shallow grades. And this is a typical turbine installation site. Here they're pouring the cement foundation, and you can get some sense of the scale looking at the front loader and the vehicle here. These are typically several hundred feet across and with dramatic changes to the landscape. This is one of the first photos I saw of this, which was one of the reasons I started to get concerned about this. This is a site in Mars Hill where they've essentially collapsed a good fraction of the mountaintop just to make a single platform for a wind turbine. To get a sense of scale of that, you can see the little, I think that's a porta potty right about there. Well, these are fairly large trees. This is not minor alteration to the landscape. This is big scale stuff. This is at the Lowell Wind Project, or the Kinney Community Wind Project near Lowell. Here they've done the opposite. Instead of collapsing part of the mountainside, they've filled it in. They brought in thousands of truckloads of fill into this project and created these enormous platforms. And along with the platforms come the roads. The roads have to be quite level and very even grade and capable of handling very, very heavy trucks and fairly straight. So this is up the side of Lowell, and you can see a lot of cutting. As I said before, this is more interstate highway type scale. This really reminds me more of I-91 than it does of a logging road. This is up on the top of Lowell. Get some sense of scale. You can see a person standing off to the right here. They blast off large areas, flatten it out. This is at Sheffield, which is another wind project up in the Northeast Kingdom nearby. This is in Massachusetts. Off in the distance there, you can see a similar type of thing. So these large alterations to the landscape are not unusual. It's not just a project here and there that does this. It's most ridgeline projects have this kind of thing. This project, I think, is down south somewhere. I don't know the name of this one. Oh, it is West Virginia. Okay. So, from the hydrological impact side, I think many people are not that aware that the mountaintops, even up on the tops, there are a lot of hydrological features that are quite sensitive. There are a lot of sort of small wetlands and other features, headwaters, whatnot, that are important for streams. These are some pictures at 4 different wind sites in Vermont, showing, I think, mostly beforehand, in some cases nearby. standing water, a lot of areas where water can soak down into the ground. And I think Andre is if he's here. Are you here, Andre? So what? You're standing in for him today? Okay, so maybe you can talk about some of those later on in the panel discussion. On birds and bats. The wind industry tries to deflect concern about birds and bats by saying things like cars, power lines, windows kill hundreds of millions of birds and many, many more birds than wind turbines kill. My problem with this kind of approach is that we're basically on a migratory pathway here. The ridges are routinely used by raptors due to the thermals and due to the geographical location that we have here. If it may be the case that if we built extensive wind development in Vermont, we might not have a huge impact on the global population of, say, red-tailed hawk. But we potentially would have a significant impact on those kinds of species, especially raptors, in this area. And those could have consequent ecological impacts that could be fairly significant. One or two projects here and there aren't going to make that much of a difference, but if we have hundreds of miles of projects, and that's really what's being proposed here, ultimately, then we could really have a serious issue with that. And the Agency of Natural Resources does recognize that to some extent. They do look at this. So far they've been fairly supportive of wind projects, but I think when we get into really massive scale development, this issue is going to become much more serious, especially now that we have bald eagles in the state. Bats, we do have endangered species of bats living in the area. Bats are pretty suppressed right now in population due to white nose syndrome. But if they transcend that, and then we build hundreds of miles of wind development in the area, we really could see significant issues with bats. It's known very well now that bats can be killed merely by flying near turbines. There have been some ridgeline projects in the United States that happen to have a lot of bats nearby and have shown very significant bat kill rates, to the point where those projects have had to been curtailed. Now, at this point, one thing I'm going to get into briefly later on is the fact that the so-called capacity factors of projects in this site, in this area, don't look very good. The wind resources here, even on the mountaintops, turned out not to be very good. In response to that, the industry, for example, the Lowell project, is tending to use now larger blades, longer blades, a larger swept area that can function more, that can extract more from the site, and that can run when wind speeds are lower. But this is exactly counter to the notion of having to maybe curtail these projects at low wind speeds. And if you really are to curtail a lot for bats, you may be able to protect a lot of bats, but you're going to really cut into the economics and the production for these sites. So that brings their economics more into question. Noise issues, there are a couple of different categories of noise issues. There's audible noise issues. These things do produce audible noise. We have a pretty good idea now of annoyance levels versus decibel levels for wind projects. And putting wind projects on mountaintops where there's a lot of line of sight connection potentially with homes and towns, and on mountains that really aren't all that high and all that far away from residences, is really potentially problematic. And we have lots and lots of noise complaints now from the Lowell project and the Sheffield project, for example. There's also an issue people refer to as infrasonic or low frequency noise. This is being sharply downplayed by the wind industry. They're saying there's no evidence of any health effects from low frequency noise. I suspect from looking at what scientific literature there is on this topic that they're wrong. I think there could be a really serious issue here, and there is a lot of anecdotal evidence that people who live close to projects within a mile or so, maybe even 2 miles, suffer serious potential impacts. And basically the idea here is that when you have a very large turbine you can get a very large, see, I guess I didn't have that, I cut that slide. You can get a very high level of very low frequency noise, which is kind of a shaking. It's a low frequency shaking. You can't hear it, but it can couple to your inner ear quite easily. That's what the research seems to show. And that can affect your sense of balance, potentially causing nausea, sleeplessness, other things like that. Kind of similar to what people call sick building syndrome in some buildings that have badly installed HVAC systems. So I think this is an emerging issue that may be kind of akin to the reluctance of the cigarette industry to admit the impacts of nicotine. Property values, this is another topic that the industry really says doesn't matter. They say that studies show that there are very little impact on property values. I think many of the earlier studies on this topic were simply flawed. There are counter studies now, more and more, suggesting that they will. And personally, I take it just kind of as a no-brainer that in Vermont, a place that is exceptionally valued for its scenic landscape, you put something that's, you put 400-foot high spinning towers, spinning windmills up on, covering large areas of ridgeline, I think it's going to have a really dramatic impact on the aesthetics, and that's going to translate into dramatic impacts on property values eventually. It seems to me there's no way around that. I want to get through a little bit of comparison now. For reasons that will become apparent here, I think we have some much better alternatives to wind in this general region in the Northeast. And to make some of these points, I'm going to step through some data that comes from the National Renewable Energy Lab. This is the best data sets I know of, the most comprehensive, technically strong, really objective. And I'm going to look at things from both a local and a regional and a national perspective to try to create a little more context to all this. One resource that much of my data that I'll show here is based on is this GIS-based study of renewable energy potentials that NREL has published a few years ago. This is the culmination of decades of work. Basic fact about wind energy. The power output of a wind turbine is basically proportional to the wind speed cubed to the raised to the third power. This just comes from the basic physics of it. Kinetic energy goes as 1/2 times the mass density times the speed squared. That's a measure of how much energy there is in a block of wind, or a cube of wind, and then you need to examine how rapidly those blocks of energy are delivered to the turbine. You multiply by another factor of V, and you get V cubed. This is a very interesting function here, V cubed. Basically, it's extremely small at low wind speeds, and it's extremely large at high wind speeds. And what this means is basically you need very high wind speeds to get significant wind energy generation. This is a power curve from some actual GE wind turbines, and you can see the same kind of shape here, although this doesn't go all the way to 0. So this has some big implications, and the biggest implication, the simplest one, is that there are very few places, really, relatively, where you have very good wind that can be commercially viable. The Midwestern United States has enormous wind resources here, and this is the dark purple colored stuff. The area that I was helping to develop was out here on the eastern plains of New Mexico, that little pocket there. This is gargantuan. The western United States has pockets, some pretty good pockets, so you can call it sort of a moderate wind resource overall. And the eastern United States as a whole has almost nothing. It's incredibly small, except for some of the ridges up in the northeast. The eastern United States, east of the Mississippi, is largely devoid of commercially viable wind resource. Here are the actual numbers. These are the top 10 states, all in the Southwest and Midwest. These are huge numbers. These are gigawatts. This is billions of watts of potential peak generation. This is what NREL estimates is actually developable in those regions. And this is what NREL estimates is actually developable in the best states in the eastern United States. 26 gigawatts in New York, and then it goes down from there. This is tiny stuff from a large scale perspective. And you can see the reason for this. You compare just Iowa to Vermont. Big two-dimensional wind resource out here. Tiny little wind resource here stretching down the ridges. Then the other thing we need to consider, not just the resource in terms of average wind speed, but what is known as capacity factor. This is a measure of how much energy is really produced at a site. It's not how often the wind blows, but it's related to that. And basically, you just simply take the actual energy you produce and divide it by the energy you would produce if you ran the project, if the project could run at peak output all year round. And it's generally accepted in the industry that a good wind site is one that has a capacity factor of about 30% or higher, maybe higher than 33%. Interestingly, in the Northeast, it looks like most projects are turning out to have capacity factors in and around the 20 to 25% range. That's not good at all. And almost as a rule, the developers project, they typically project 30 to 35%, something in that range. And then it turns out, from what we can tell, the projects don't really seem to produce that way. Here's a whole listing of wind projects in New York State, for example, looking at comprehensively 2 years worth of data. GMP actually publicly admitted their Searsburg project is down in this range. Okay, now going back to those numbers, if we take all of what NREL thinks is viable wind resource added up, it comes up to be about 51 gigawatts, 50% of which is in New York. And we can start to, whoops, I should say 51, I said 52. If we multiply that by the capacity factor, we get about 15 gigawatts. That's really what it's can be effectively rated at. Current U.S. average consumption is about 470 gigawatts. So if we take all of that wind potential in the eastern United States and compare it to the national scale, we get a very small number. It's about 3%. It could produce about 3% of the nation's energy. I'll drill it down to a more regional point of view in a second. It's about 7% of the entire eastern United States. All right, now, the real potential is probably a lot less than that, and I'll mention why. These NREL estimates are actually gross upper bounds. They do not take into account all sorts of environmental factors and topographical factors and other things that really affect whether a project can be built. The true number for the Northeast is probably somewhere down in this range, 2 to 10 gigawatts. Maybe 5 as being the number that people seem to really talk about, the industry really talks about doing. So really, there is really not any evidence to suggest that the real potential of wind power in the eastern United States or in the Northeast is really much greater than that. It might be a little bit greater than that, but that there's no real support for that. So we just get a sense of scale here. This is a picture of the areas served by the New York ISO and ISO New England. These show some graphs of the sort of daily demand profile for these giant areas. And you can see here in the New York system, it peaks out at about 40,000 megawatts. That's about 40 gigawatts, about 28 gigawatts here in the Eastern ISO. And with these numbers and with other numbers, you can sort of get some idea of what we could really do here. So let's ask ourselves, suppose we had that 5 gigawatts, say in Vermont and New Hampshire. First of all, this is going to require 333 miles at least of wind development. That's basically stretching from the top of Vermont all the way down to the bottom continuously and back up. And that's assuming the largest turbines available that the people are installing here spaced 5 to a mile. It's a very, very dense kind of development. Realistically, maybe be twice the length of Here's that. This is what that would supply. So on a peak level, that would be just 2.2% of the current peak demand. If you look at the total energy consumption, annual energy consumption, it's a little bit less than 5% of that. And it's less than about 2% of the total demand in the Northeast. So these are small numbers. So I just conclude from that, from an analytical standpoint, ridgeline wind in particular is not a significant renewable energy resource for the region. It just isn't. It's a minor source, even despite the size of the turbines and potentially using hundreds or thousands of miles of ridgeline. And supplying even a small fraction. When I look at those pictures of the kind of development that is required here, what I see is that just getting to those small percentages would incur really enormous impacts to the area. I think that's inescapable. So that begs the question, what else are we going to do? Are there better alternatives? Often when I give this talk, somebody will stand up in the back and say, well, what about climate change? And, they're right. We have to address that. This is a chart of the solar energy resource in Vermont. Actually, this is for Montpelier. Amazingly, solar energy is a pretty good resource here. When I first moved here from New Mexico, I was pretty skeptical of that, and I started collecting data on systems and studying it, but I'm now convinced it's probably the best source we've got. It's a little weak down here in November, December, October, but still not completely terrible. The study that I showed you earlier from NREL lists capacity factors for Vermont and for Arizona, for example, and you can divide those, and what you find, and I've verified this in practice, you can produce from a solar project in Vermont, nearly 70% as much as the same project will produce in Arizona. That's pretty good. If it was 20%, 30%, I'd probably say we need to do something else maybe. But that's not half bad. We have people here that live off of solar power. The scale of the solar resource is also just incredibly enormous. It's mainly because it's ubiquitous, it's around everywhere, and also because the technology we mainly use here, photovoltaics, is completely scalable. So you have small scale stuff like rooftops. I like this one because I think it probably would shed snow pretty well. It's an under-addressed issue maybe for PV installations in Vermont. Here's another small-scale pole-mounted systems. These are even better because you can tilt them up more and shed snow even better and get better production in the wintertime. We've seen projects like this, small commercial scale. This is you probably recognize that. Anyone know what that is? That's the Escobar that are down there on Route 100. And quite a few of these projects in Vermont. These are trackers that track the sun. Pretty effective technology. Utility scale. This is up near, actually at the Burlington Airport. There are issues with this. There are certainly aesthetic issues. There are potentially groundwater, stormwater runoff issues. We have to be careful with these kinds of projects too. If we do these wrong, we can potentially cause a lot of resistance, unnecessary resistance, and lack of support for this stuff too. So there's a lot of the same comments that I made about wind do apply to solar, maybe in a little weaker form. All right, going back, we'll shift there, strange. Going back to that NREL study, that GIS study, that GIS study contains very detailed results, state by state, for what NREL considers to be the developable potential for solar in the Northeast. The gross number of gigawatts is enormous, 2,500 gigawatts of potentially developable solar potential. What they did was did a thorough GIS analysis of the Northeast, identify sites according to various criteria, rule out a lot of sites. I'm sure that this is somewhat of a gross upper estimate as well, but I think it's probably less of a gross upper estimate than more of this, a larger fraction of this is probably developable than the wind one. Let's drill down here and look at Vermont. So what they estimate for Vermont is that there's about 1 gigawatt of peak rooftop potential. At peak, that would be quite a bit more than even the Yankee nuclear plant puts out. About 1 gigawatt of urban potential. This is defined as utility scale projects, smaller utility scale projects that are less than 18,000 square feet in urban boundaries. And then in rural areas, upwards of 35 gigawatts of potentially developable solar. And that's ruling out actually a great deal of land, farmland, and other places that wouldn't be suitable. So that's enormous. This dwarfs the entire wind energy, likely developable wind energy potential for the entire eastern United States. And as it says here, even just the rooftop potential significantly exceeds the onshore wind resource. So this is really just from this perspective, this is really our big renewable energy resource. If we're going to really do something, it's probably the right one to look at. Economics issues, there's a lot of discussion about this. Wind industry often says wind energy is cheap. It's true that out in the Midwest, a lot of the projects have come in at pretty reasonable prices. That's definitely the case. But ridgeline wind projects are not very cheap for a variety of factors. They're relatively small, the development costs are very high, the sites are difficult, a lot of mitigation issues, capacity factors not so great. Here's the general trend of wind energy costs. What we saw was they did indeed come down a lot over the years. And this is not for ridgeline. Ridgeline projects are typically still up in this range. But for the industry as a whole, they came down. But they kind of stopped decreasing after about 2000. And I think at this point, we got down to about the level of the likely sort of minimum level of the technology. Wind requires tremendous amounts of cement and steel and copper, fiberglass, things that are very intrinsic to the physics of wind turbines. It's hard to get much better than that. You might be able to get a little better by tweaking the technology, making the rotors a little more efficient, but not too much. Then what happened was, due to, I think, large demand for cement and steel in China, commodity costs of those materials rose sharply, and the cost of wind energy actually rose the next decade. Then the economic downturn happened and basically caused a lot of the wind industry to be shelved. Turbine prices have come down sharply since then, but not incredibly dramatically, and we're down to about where we were about 10 years ago. Solar costs, though, have done something a bit different. They've come down over the decades, come down pretty dramatically as well. Then the industry started to run out of silicon around 2005, 2006. They had to build their own silicon production facilities instead of just using the leftovers from the semiconductor industry. And then when they got overdone paying for that, and then with strong growth in Chinese production, the cost of solar has really ramped down as the scale of PV production has gone up. And I put in, this report from NREL has up to this point, and I put in the more recent data since then. You can buy modules now for under $1 a watt, which is amazing. And that's a level I never thought I would see before 2015 or so. But there it is. And it still potentially could come down a lot more. So solar is really getting there. This is a cost comparison chart from the American Wind Energy Association, and it shows their cost comparisons. They've got photovoltaics down here, and they've got land-based wind here. The only problem with this cost range is it actually doesn't apply to the ridgeline projects. This is more of the lower cost projects. The real range of wind projects, and I put this here, so this is my addition. The actual range of ridgeline projects, as best we can tell from what we've heard about a few particular projects and what we can infer, is that it's somewhere in this range, 10 cents to 20 cents a kilowatt hour. And that's where PV is now, overlapping well with that. So we're actually getting down now for the first time in the range where photovoltaics can really compete with wind. And there's a hidden cost here. These costs do not include the cost of potentially a large amount of transmission development. But the Northeast grid is fairly congested. Our rural grids are not able to take a lot of large new wind projects. Both the Sheffield and the Lowell project actually have been curtailed significantly by the ISO because the system can't take a lot of the power much of the time. That's been in the news a little bit. We have information, though, from the ISO, for example, that it would cost somewhere upwards of about $10 billion to build the kind of transmission infrastructure that would be required to build that 5,000 megawatts of wind and some of that, bring in some of that hydropower. This comes from an article a couple of years ago, actually 4 years ago now, but those costs have not changed. And I like to note that the guy who said this from the ISO, he has a terrible last name for a CEO. But I think his estimate's pretty good there. And it's fairly obvious, actually, to really get transmission significantly to lots of wind projects in the Northeast, you're going to need upwards of 4,000 miles of new transmission lines. And if you're paying a couple million apiece for those per mile, get up into that 10 billion. If you put that in the wind cost equation, you basically double the cost of wind, and it's nowhere in the ballpark. It's not even close to being economical. So I see solar as really much better from a cost standpoint. There's another thing with solar is we're still working right now with kind of an older technology, mostly crystalline silicon technology. That has kept pace pretty well. As it's scaled up, its cost has decreased a lot. But there's a huge amount of potential technological improvement for solar, potentially much cheaper materials and potentially much higher efficiencies that we're getting right now. And I think over time we're going to see that. The basic physics is there now. It's just a matter of bringing newer technologies to market. So my overall conclusion, when I look at wind and solar in the region, is there's really no justification for ridgeline wind, either from a resource or an economic or environmental point of view. And I'm pretty concerned, actually. I think as you'll hear more from the panel tonight, the system is pretty rigged up right now to push these kinds of projects through. Communities have very little say in siting of energy projects in Vermont under Section 248. The power industry is really afraid of solar power. Distributed solar power is a big threat to the bottom line. It sounds like conspiracy theory stuff, but it's true. They really love wind power in the Northeast because it gives them a chance to continue to dominate the electricity generation picture. So we're up against potentially a lot here. And this is my last content slide. I hope am I doing okay on time? All right, I'm a little long. All right, I'll wrap it up. I study a lot more than just wind and solar. I look at heat pumps and hydro and solar hot water and other types of sources. And when I look at them all together, I see that there are a certain sort of grouping of sources that have very high potential for contributing to the energy supply, but very low impacts. I think that this is where we should be focusing. We should be focusing on photovoltaics, ground source and air source heat pumps, solar hot water, farm cellulosic biomass, concentrating solar power, if appropriately sited in the West. Midwest wind power, moderate impact, moderate potential relative to these. And other things make sense in Vermont too. Anaerobic digesters don't have a huge amount of potential, but they have low impact, and actually very negative impact. They're very good for farms, dairy farms. So this is kind of really potentially where we should be focusing. And I'll leave you with this nice picture.
Thank you, Ben. That was great. really enjoyed that presentation. So for this next part of the evening, we're going to have a panel discussion, as we mentioned, and we're going to pose some questions for the panelists, and then we're going to actually open it up for questions. So that's really what we want to allow quite a bit of time for you to ask the panelists questions. So we're just going to ask them a few to kind of tee this up. So actually one thing I did want to mention before we disband and everything, while I have the mic, is I want to mention that we're going to be having an energy fair here in Moretown on Saturday, May 31st. So if you want to learn more about some of the solar technologies that Ben mentioned, as well as energy efficiency and workshops and all that, it's going to be at the Moretown School and Rec Fields from 9 to 3 on May 31st. So put that on your calendar if you want to learn more about this. So for the panel discussion, Annette Smith is going to be the facilitator for that. She's the executive director of Vermonters for a Clean Environment, a nonprofit statewide organization formed in 1999 in response to a $1 billion natural gas power plant and pipeline proposal. VCE helps raise the voices of Vermonters to hold corporations accountable and assist citizens in participating in regulatory proceedings. And VCE has been working on the issue of wind development in Vermont since 2009. And that is a graduate of Vassar College in European history. And as Ben mentioned, she lives off the grid on solar. So I'm going to have Annette lead the discussion. Our other panelists, in addition to Ben, are going to be Steve Wright. Right, there's Steve. Steve is a member of Ridge Protectors, a nonprofit created early in the Sheffield Wind Project struggle to educate Vermonters as to the value of its landscape, especially at higher elevations. Steve spent nearly 25 years in association with Sterling College, in roles from classroom teacher to president. He's worked as a wilderness manager and spent 7 years on the Vermont State Environmental Board. Steve's an aquatic biologist and former commissioner of the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department and lives in Craftsbury Commons. And our other speaker, Andreas Trevizo, is unfortunately home with the flu, with a stomach bug, wasn't able to be here. So Robin Clark has graciously agreed to step in for him. And Robin actually lives in Lowell, very close to the Lowell project, and has firsthand experience on what it was like to be there when that development happened, and is now living very close to that development. So she can share firsthand experience about that. So I'm going to turn it over now to Annette. And
Robin and Stephen back together.
That's my spoon.
You guys get two microphones.
All right, well, should we sit all together then?
Yeah.
Okay. It's very loud still.
So, can you hear me all right? Okay. Thank you for coming on this lovely evening. And the context for this meeting tonight is that Moretown is doing a town plan update, as is my town of Danby. In fact, we had our public meeting for a workshop to get input from the public just 2 nights ago. And the town plan really is your voice in regulatory proceedings. In Act 250, town plans carry weight. So if a town plan says something is not supposed to happen in a certain area, then that can stop a project. Say you have a quarry proposed in an area that is not allowed in your zoning. That will stop it in Act 250. Section 248 is what energy projects are reviewed under. And in Section 248, town plans are given due consideration. However, they can be overruled by the Public Service Board, which is 3 members appointed by the governor. But it is the only voice that you have in the regulatory proceeding, aside from going to a public hearing and speaking. However, that is not evidence, and that they just want to hear what you have to say so that they know what questions to look at. Or you can intervene as a town, and we can explore what that's like. What the Public Service Board needs from you as you look at crafting your town plan is they need a clear written community standard. If you have a town plan that says in your energy section, we support renewable energy, and then in another section says we don't want ridgeline development, that's inconsistent. And so you need to have your sections of your town plan consistent from one section to another. And because of a Supreme Court decision, it must be specific. So for instance, if you don't want wind turbines on the Northfield Ridge, it needs to name the mountain. And this goes for any issue. Wind is just one example. But whether it's Act 250 as you're thinking about, and I serve on the Rutland Regional Planning Commission, and we had an executive director who absolutely did not like the fact that town plans play a role in the regulatory process. And he said they're visionary, they're not supposed to be regulatory. Well, the fact is, they are regulatory, and you need to think in those terms as you're doing your town plan update. And because of the Supreme Court decision, for the areas that you want to have a say in these proceedings, they need to be regulatory. So that's sort of the context through which we're trying to help educate for you tonight as you think about language to put in your town plan. I can provide you with many, many examples of towns that have gone through this that have dealt with wind turbine proposals and have crafted language, and I gotta say, every town comes up with something different. It's really quite amazing to see. The town of Waitsfield, if you want to look at their town plan, has pages and pages and pages of language, a lot of it about solar, that normally would be in zoning, but zoning plays no role at all in the Public Service Board proceeding. And so the Waitsfield town plan is very good. The way they deal with the ridgeline, it says no development above 1,700 feet. And so that's one way of doing it. So there are many different ways of doing it, and it really is up to the townspeople to come together and decide what it is you want, and then how to express that in your town plan. And if you don't, then you're not helping the Public Service Board understand what you want. So for instance, in Lowell, they had language that said that the Lowell Ridgeline was one of the most scenic drives in the state along Route 58. And they should be protected. They also had language that said we support renewable energy. And so the Public Service Board picks and chooses what they want to defend their decision based on certificates. So that's where we're going to take off from. So we have the opportunity, because we are not approaching wind energy now afresh. We have the Sheffield project, which became operational at the end of 2011. The Lowell project became operational at the end of 2012. So did the Georgia Mountain project. So we have an opportunity to learn. Now you do have interest. About a year ago, a wind developer approached someone in Moretown looking for a site for a net tower. So there is interest in doing something in Moretown. And so that's something for you all to be aware of and keep in mind about what is it that you want for your town. And with Robin and Ben and Steve to talk about what lessons have been learned from Lowell. We all benefit from their experience. So Steve, let's start with you. And we need to use the microphone for the filming, and so you guys can pass it around. So what would you like to tell us about what you've learned from the Lowell project and your involvement?
I would like to say to all of you that you leave here ready to get busy and do some of the hardest work that you've ever done in your life, regardless of your profession or your hobbies or what things you just have to do. This is a highly technical, as you can probably understand from Ben's presentation. Ben's a PhD. There are not a lot of those around. People don't just, institutions don't.
Wasn't that hard, was it?
Well, I quit and came to Vermont. That may have been better than getting a PhD, but at any rate, it's highly technical. It is intensely political, and it includes a social and cultural element that can be bitter and confrontation. Those are things that generally tend to discourage people from participating in something. So my advice to you is to take a deep breath, try to come to some understanding as to why you're concerned about this particular issue, and then prepare yourself to be involved if you want to continue down the road. We started in Craftsbury with a simple resolution from our Conservation Commission, to a request actually of the Select Board that the Conservation Commission be allowed to be the central contact point for the town of Craftsbury in the proposed development on the Lowell Ridgeway. And that simple step gave our Conservation Commission authority to do a whole lot of stuff, such as propose, again, for their approval to the Select Board, that we petition the Public Service Board for intervenor status, and to begin building a fund that would allow us to hire expert witnesses and an attorney and so on and so forth. That was an enabling act, very simple, by the Conservation Commission that put us on the road to being an effective voice in the Northeast Kingdom with regard to the Lowell project. Vermont's founded largely on home rule issues or basis, and the attempted implementation of making these 36 square mile approximately units of land and culture and society self-governing has changed drastically, but some of those themes still exist. So if a town, Green Mountain Power did something very smart, in fact might be considered brilliant. They found a place where there was a limited wind resource. They found it in a relatively poor town, so-called poor town in the Northeast Kingdom, didn't have a ski area, didn't have a water park, and so on and so forth. And Green Mountain Power went into that town, and they convinced those folks on the basis of tax reform to approve the development that you see right there. And by the way, that last shot, just for reference purpose, can you back that up right now? The buildings that you see down there in the center right are the Nelson Farm. And you heard a lot about the Nelson Farm. And you might say, well, you might conclude, well, no wonder Shirley Nelson was awakened in the middle of the night and made sick by this. And no wonder that the Nelsons fought for a number of years. That has to be one of the most spectacular locations for any sort of farmland. It's been in that family for 72 years. And of course, you know that story. Get organized. So what is the final goal here? I assume that your goal, and one of the reasons that you're here, it may have nothing to do with wind, but you're interested in protecting the character and the function of this landscape that now tends to be occupied by your town. If that's the reason you're here, then you need to master some of these technical issues and social issues and be adept at presenting information to the larger public. The bottom line here is to get the legislature to understand fundamental issues that are in exchange, over which this exchange occurs. One side of the issue says climate change is serious. We need to take it seriously. And building more renewable energy is a way to resolve the climate crisis. Another point of view says that climate change is a serious problem. We must take it seriously. And the best way to deal with it is to reduce the effect, reduce the deposition of greenhouse gases, and which includes carbon dioxide. So reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. Those are the two fundamental approaches here. You either reduce emissions or you increase renewable energy. Well, we believe that we have proven our point that increasing renewable energy development does not necessarily reduce carbon emissions, and therefore is a failed approach to climate change. So if your cause in life, your bigger cause, is to help society reduce its effect on the planet, then you need to be talking about reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Forget this myth of building more renewable energy.
Thank you, Steve.
Done.
Robert, you've lived with the Lowell project, she's got a microphone, since before it started through Lowell. What would you like to share tonight with us?
Well, I just want everybody to know I'm here because I'm a concerned citizen. I'm not an expert, but I'm well informed. I've been with the Lowell project since its conception. And we've had experience with flooding in town. During construction, it was in the spring of 2012, after the mountain had been logged off and clear cut. We had disastrous flooding. I'm sure you can see that in the photos that Annette is showing now. This was just a small, it's the headwater stream of the Missisquoi River. This is in the this picture is Lower Village Road, right off of Route 100. Several families had to be evacuated. It was probably the worst flood we've had in more than a century, and it was just a localized thunderstorm. It wasn't a hurricane, it wasn't a big storm by any means. They did, and this picture here is a picture of, believe it or not, a hydro plant that was lost in the flood. Even to this day, he's only got it back to probably half capacity. The state did not want to help him. The river here was probably up 10 or 20 feet from the riverbed. It just was incredible. We were lucky that there weren't people lost in this flood. As I said, I've been fortunate enough to be able to visit the project with Energize Vermont. They did appeal the stormwater permit, so we were able to go up on the mountain during construction before the turbines were up. Believe it or not, you saw pictures of wetlands and swamps and bogs. They're all gone. The mountaintop was like a desert. We have 6 miles of exposed rock and a semi-impervious road. There's gallons and hundreds and thousands of gallons of stormwater now coming off the mountain. The stormwater permit was approved by A&R. To my disbelief, I was amazed that they have never denied a stormwater permit. They help the developer get the permit approved. They approved a plan that was experimental. They approved level spreaders. And what they are, not to get too technical, it was cheaper than building sediment ponds. And the theory is that the stormwater will come down into these level spreaders and disperse the water as an even flow. But as sediment builds up, they are now streaming and causing erosion. the road is a gravel road. The pitch of the road was extremely important. On one side, you have clean mountain water going into the brooks. On the other side, you have storm water. So if anybody has been on a gravel road in Vermont, you know what happens after it rains. The pitch of the road changes. Now we have clean storm water, dirty storm water going into clean brooks. And we have heated storm water going into our brooks. And hydrology has changed. It's a sad thing. We struggle with noise. We struggle with loss of habitat. Of their capacity. It was just a huge waste of money.
And they promised 35%.
Yeah. And everything that the opponents have said has come true. They're selling the renewable certificates out of state, so these projects are no longer considered renewable in Vermont. We've lost wildlife habitat. Our community is so divided and fragmented that if we oppose the project, we're looked upon as troublemakers, or outsiders or flatlanders, whatever you want to call us, that's what we are. But we do care about what has happened in the town. The supply, also the demand for power is down. The curtailment, as Ben spoke about, happens frequently. We've just had 2 beautiful windy days and now the turbine turning. It's pretty sad to see a project sitting there just doing nothing with what we've been through. I don't know.
What about your taxes?
Yes, our taxes have dropped by 1/3, but our town has been run by 2 very prominent families, and this year's budget already surpassed what we received. They're already spending more than what they have coming in.
So, Ben, I wanted to ask you how you would respond to this. I was on DPR's Vermont edition last week, and I was introduced as an anti-removal zealot. And someone sent out something saying that I never miss an opportunity to give the talking points of the fossil fuel industry. So, Ben, I don't know, do you run into this because you have spoken against wind in Vermont, and how do you respond to things like that?
Yeah, it's when you want to discredit somebody, there's 2 things you can do. You can go after their arguments, or you can launch an ad hominem attack on them and try to discredit them by association and get at their credibility. And I've heard all that kind of stuff many times. It's a tactic, and it's very sad to see that entering. It's very sad to see people who are, in some cases, professional environmental advocates engaging in that kind of thing. It's not true. I do this out of my conscience. I don't get paid for this. I take a lot of abuse just because I believe that this is the right thing to do. And I think you're in a similar boat. Many of us are in a similar boat.
I think the comment, though, is worth exploring because, just as with the wind industry and the way it divides towns, it's happening on a statewide level. That it's either you're in favor of wind and building it everywhere, or you see that it does a lot of harm.
There tends to be, I think, with the professional environmental community out there's a great fear of breaking ranks. For years and years, and I was involved in this, that we had the point of view of we've got to promote all of these renewable sources. We don't know which ones are going to work out best. We don't want infighting. So it was sort of a taboo subject to start comparing these and really making tough choices. I've also found, just working with utilities and working with many different energy companies, both ones we had to deal with on the fossil fuel side in New Mexico that we were trying to basically replace, and the renewable companies. Corporations will just say what they want. It's very hard to hold a corporation accountable for whether their statements are true or not. For example, if the capacity factor, if they, Green Mountain Power says the capacity factor is going to be 35%, and it's actually 20%, you can't, after the project's built, there's almost no hope of going back and using that and saying, hey, they lied. Let's take the project down. Same thing with other tactics that go on. So yeah, it's unfortunate that the dialogue has gone to that level. Did anyone hear, I only heard a snippet of this, but E.O. Wilson's talk the other day on PPR?
I did.
Hear that environment? It was a very well-respected environmentalist. He said, reason is the last resort of human beings often. And I think that that's the case where now we have a lot of zealousness, there's a lot of money at stake. People are using climate change as an excuse to promote their own business interests. Politicians align with that when they get near that money. Environmental groups start getting donations from various foundations that get funded indirectly through corporate interests usually. So they get behind the stuff, they kind of all mesh together. It's a very tough thing to break. And I think what my prediction of what's going to happen in the Northeast is we're going to see significant amount of additional wind development. It's going to alienate a lot of the public. The resistance groups, there are incredible amount of resistance now. It's going to get more and more, and eventually it's going to translate into political. People are using climate change as an excuse to promote their own business interests. Politicians align with that when they get near that money. Environmental groups start getting donations from various foundations that get funded indirectly through corporate interests usually. So they get behind the stuff, they kind of all mesh together. That's a very tough thing to break. And I think what my prediction of what's going to happen in the Northeast is we're going to see significant amount of additional wind development. It's going to alienate a lot of the public. The resistance groups, there are incredible amount of resistance now. It's going to get more and more, and eventually it's going to translate into political, a lack of political support for renewables, and we're going to have a profound problem on our hands. We're going to be talking to an ultra skeptical public. Electricity costs will be high, well, because of paying for these projects. They're not affordable. We're paying for them, even though the renewable energy credits are sold out of state. We're paying extra for them. The
So
business.
therefore, it's not really renewable energy.
It's not really renewable energy for our state. We can't really count it that way. It's just, but yet its very presence is suppressing additional renewable energy development here. While it's also suppressing renewable energy development in the states where the renewable energy credits are sold. So that's a whole technical problem with the policy. But more fundamentally, we are hearing from the business community already that they're upset about the upward trend in the electricity rates that are associated with this stuff. And there's not going to be much headroom left in rates. Efficiency Vermont, for example, is funded through a tariff put on electricity rates. Renewables can be funded in the same way. In fact, they are funded in the same way for things like renewable energy credit buyback programs where homeowners can get paid for the renewable energy credits they generate from utilities, or for tax incentives or for rebates and things like that. But once people are fed up, they feel like if people as a whole, or just a large fraction of the public feels like they've been ripped off, that hundreds or billions of dollars in Vermont have been spent on boondoggle type projects. The appetite for really going forward and saying, how do we really transition this state to sustainable energy sources? How do we really get the PACE program going and get other programs going and really get our buildings thermalized, better energy, thermal energy efficiency, better electrical energy efficiency. These kind of things are going to start to stagnate at some point. And in Maine, this has already happened. The political winds have shifted. They now have a governor who's anti-wind, basically, and that's reflecting the fact that a lot of people have been really, I believe I saw some skeptical face there. Is that true?
I think the same governor's been there for the last.
Hey,
The current governor has come out. I thought there had been a change.
He's been there for about 2 years. He's a Tea Party.
Yeah, about 2 years ago, he shifted. There was an election, and the current governor is much less supportive of where the state was going. And I think that reflects in large part the large resistance movement that has emerged in Maine. I hear a lot from those folks.
So ask Steve, you worked for National Wildlife Federation as a climate change advocate and went around New England. How do you see we can bridge this gap, a big gap between people who are promoting wind energy and supporting it, which means most of the environmental groups in the state, and the people who live in communities threatened by these projects who are learning about what the impacts are? And from your perspective, do you see a way to bring the conversation closer and also work towards more effective climate change action?
That has been, and anyone who spends any time around me knows, the most confounding, perplexing, complicated, difficult to understand issue. And the issue, again, if you spend any time with me, that I'm constantly tearing my hair out over. I have been an active member of the Vermont Conservation Community since I came to Vermont from rural Georgia in 1968. I've served on a number of boards, worked with and for some organizations during that period of time. And the fact that we cannot have a civil conversation with members of the Vermont environmental community, so-called Vermont environmental community, is maddening to a person who spent his life working both in the public and private sectors and trying to learn how to develop techniques for beginning effective conversations, beginning exchanges, beginning discourse. Discourse, as a close friend of mine said to me the other day, the very foundation of democracy. And it's the one thing, one aspect that we lack in the wind debate. Because we have the larger community of decision makers have decided that they are right. And it doesn't matter what Professor Lewis says, or what informed residents from Lowell say, or what people from other towns in the region say with regard to Lowell. We are right, and we will impose our will on you. That is the current reality that we face. We've had 2 sessions of 2 years running of the legislature in which we basically have tried to manipulate to some degree legislation to give local folks more of a voice. We've really not accomplished anything with that. The basis of that was developing a conversation outside the hall and within the hall of the legislature with environmental groups, with the administration, and with the entire legislature. And we've been fundamentally unsuccessful with that, in spite of the help of a lot of other people. So, and that, I don't know. I don't know how to do that. I've gone to my former friends and colleagues and said, can we sit down, 3 of us, 3 or 4 of us, and 3 or 4 of you, maybe some of your board members, and have a helpful, progressive conversation over this issue. And basically the response has been, don't bother us. So we're still working at that. The goal is our goal and our approach, and these folks have been very much involved in it, is to continue to educate, to do what we're doing right now. And I will go anywhere in Vermont to tell the story of what's going on in Lowell. And I know these folks will too, because I keep following them, or they keep following me. You keep showing up at the same meeting. And the reason I'm on the stool is that I'm sick and tired of being shorter than Ben. There's another reason, but I won't bore you with that tonight. But it's one of the confounding things. Helpful discourse is what we need. It's what we're having here tonight. And I know you have some questions.
And I want to explore one more area with Robin, and then we'll get to the audience questions. An example of what Steve was talking about is in this legislative session, there is a really, I would call a very weak bill that's not going to get through, that has in it, for instance, that town plans would be given, instead of due consideration of the Public Service Board, substantial deference. That some of our former colleagues in the environmental community have come in and said, that's outrageous, that will slow down the process, and it can't happen. So even just giving a little more weight to our town plans has been fought against. And that's the climate in which we're operating. Robin, I put up a slide of a home in, I believe it's in Lowell, but it's very close to the Albany border. This was owned by a couple who sold a home at below assessed value. They both developed heart issues after the wind turbines came in, and the noise was very, very bothersome to them, and they were really quite frightened for their health. And so they did sell out at reduced value. Robin, can you talk about what is happening in your area with property values?
Well, one would say it's a buyer's market. Property values are selling below assessed value, not even fair market value. On my road alone, I live 1.5 miles north of the project. There's been 4 households sold on my road well below assessed value. And I just want to leave one thought with everybody. And the thought is, how many intact ecosystems can we destroy before we have an undue adverse effect? And I don't mean just with wind, I mean every time we do some sort of construction, we are affecting the ecosystem. It's just a thought to put out there. We are destroying these ridgelines that are completely an intact ecosystem, and there's really no need for it. Deforestation, in my mind, is one of the worst things that should be done.
So, to lead into the question and answer period, we are going to give the portable microphone to Dennis, who is going to take it around for your questions. And it's important to please use the microphone because this is being filmed for the local access cable station. And we had some maps prepared for you, so this helps sort of ground the discussion in Moretown. This is your wetlands. There's a lot of water. I've looked at a lot of towns and a lot of town maps, and you have a lot of water. You have some conserved lands. These are the residences. Basically, these are the structures. These are the elevations above 1,500 feet. The wind industry used to look for 2,000 to 3,000 feet. Now they're using the longer blades, as Ben spoke of, and so they have low wind turbines. And so these are all the areas in your town that have that resource. This is your parcel map, and so you have an area, for instance, here, that is a fairly large area, and it is in the high wind resource area. And so this puts them all together. And so you see you have your high elevation area, you have a large parcel, you also have a lot of streams going down. And then to take another look at it, this is the 1 mile buffer around it if you had a string of wind turbines there. And that gives you some sense of how many people live within 1 mile of that ridgeline. So I hope that that is helpful to you in thinking about this issue in Moretown. And so, open it up to questions. And if you state your name first, that would be great.
Yeah, absolutely. My name is Paul Brown. I live in Northfield. Bald Mountain is in my backyard. I came here tonight hoping that there was going to be a discussion about large wind scale development and not a program in opposition to industrial scale wind development. I'm disappointed by that. You know, I'm a graduate of Sterling College. I was there when Steve was president of Sterling College, and that experience is... I'm sorry?
You grew up.
I did, and that experience was one of the best experiences of my adult life. And I backpacked on the Lower Mountain Range as a part of being a student at Sterling College. I now live with Bald Mountain in my backyard. My solar panels are going in tomorrow or the week after. I have absolutely nothing to gain personally by the installation of industrial wind in my backyard. But myself and my family support that development. I've listened very carefully to all of the arguments in opposition to it. And some of them for me, and I'm not a zealot, I'm not a member of any environmental organization, with the exception of my employment. To be described as such is part of the reason why this issue is so divisive. To hear arguments like habitat fragmentation or habitat loss is a meaningless expression without identifying specific species. To talk about hydrological changes when 30% of Vermont's electricity comes from the most damaged landscape in North America, to talk about the loss of birds and bats without launching a simultaneous campaign against domestic cats that live outdoors. It's not that I haven't heard your arguments. I have. I've listened to them very closely for many years now, and I've considered them. They just don't resonate with me. They don't hold water for me. Except for the economic argument.
Can you say specifically why?
Why they don't? For the reasons I've just listed. For the reasons I've just listed. The idea of habitat fragmentation, or that habitats are no longer intact, is a scientifically ridiculous term.
I put up a slide
know
here
that.
just to because I had it, and just to be clear, here's Moretown. This
Yep.
is from the Agency of Natural Resources Biofinder, and the coloration is habitat blocks. And so the darker the block, the larger the area is. And so this shows that Moretown's habitat block is not the smallest, which is the light yellow, not...
Okay, to talk about habitat
so
without
these-
talking about species is ridiculous.
Well-
Can I ask you one question? Let's just take raptors.
Yeah.
Mountaintop environments are raptor habitat.
Okay.
When I talk about those becoming exceptionally hazardous places for those particular species, and I mentioned that class of species very specifically, that is part of that. Same thing with bats. That's also a specific species. I even mentioned specifically that there are endangered species of bats here.
You won't find denial from anybody that humans have an impact on the environment. And the things that we do, the choices that we make, have impacts. There's no denial. The state of Vermont was deforested 100 years ago. There's a radar installation somewhere in the Northeast Kingdom. I don't remember where. I've been there. It was abandoned 40, 50 years ago. It's nearly naturalized now. We have granite quarries, the deepest hole in Earth, I think, right in Moretown, that the tailings pile now are a historic landmark. They're a resource. We have profoundly changed the face of this planet and this state, and we continue to do so.
Let me ask you. So, if I follow the logic of your reasoning, you're saying because we created enormous impacts in the past, and because we've got all these other impacts, it's okay to just add more.
Absolutely not. No, that's not what I'm saying at all. No, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that we make choices about where we get our electricity from.
So can I...
We make choices in where we build.
So which choices
in the types of developments that we undertake.
So do you have an argument to say that it is absolutely essential that we do wind development and incur those environmental impacts as opposed to doing something else?
Of course it's not absolutely essential, nor was the construction of the interstates, nor a water park at JP. Those are choices that we've made.
Choices you didn't have either.
But the environmental,
You have a choice now. You didn't have a choice.
the environmental
How
community,
many times have you been to the top of Bald
Can we
Mountain?
just get one person?
More than I can count. It's in my
Okay, now,
backyard.
do
It's
you
where I
think
go
that
for
if there
solace
was a road on
and
top
retreat.
of Bald Mountain, and there were windows, that it would be anything that you would say special anymore? It's like heaven up there. I'm not religious, but it's heaven up there. I've been up there
So
many
Can
times.
you
I live
get
right
the
there.
It's in my backyard.
If he wants to
It's
speak.
in my backyard.
That's my
I like this debate though, because I think this gets into essential territory. And what I would say to you is that you really are effectively saying, because we've done all this other destruction, we can just do more of this. And what I'm saying back to you is that this is not a discussion about whether we should have renewable energy or not. It's how we can do it. We actually do have a choice over when we do this. And the interstate, for example, there was a Green Mountain Parkway that was going to be built right down the mountain ridges that wasn't built, and people did effectively oppose that. The same thing can happen here. And I really honestly believe, if we go forward with lots of wind development in Vermont and the rest of the Northeast, all we're going to do is produce a little tiny bit of the electrical load from that source. We're going to profoundly alienate the public, profoundly damage the environment, profoundly damage the economy, and the real task of really addressing climate change in the Northeast, getting 1,000 megawatts of renewable generation off the ground is not going to happen very fast. It's going to set us back decades.
So we'll come back to you, but let's give
But
up.
that would be my response to you.
All right, so you had something?
Well, I'll try to make mine fairly quick, but it kind of goes back to what Robin was saying here. On property values.
Is that on?
Hold the microphone closer, that one's kind of weak.
Closer? Yeah, good. Okay, so Robin was talking about property evaluation. Now, from what we've been hearing, and my numbers may not be deadly accurate, but there's a Hollywood character actor that lives up in the lower Sheffield region, Louis Newsman, and he moved to Vermont because it was his picture of paradise. Well, since the wind turbines have gone in, he has a house that, if my numbers are correct, was worth $1.4 million. Now that the wind power is up, his picture of heaven he moved to has been very much modified, so he wants to get the hell out now. My last understanding was he had reduced his asking price from $1.4 million, where it was valued, down to somewhere half of that. So, as far as the incentives that you got from the power company and your tax deduction, how does a 50% devaluation of property equate to whatever it was that you received as a check every year?
Well, we don't actually receive a check, we just receive money off of our municipal tax bill. We still pay school tax. For me, there's no money that's worth what we've lost. And the people that are in favor for it in town, I just hope that they never have to sell the property. We've all worked very hard for what we have, and honestly, it was our retirement. We have everything invested in our home, and someday we probably will have to sell because we'll be too old to maintain what we have. It's just a way of life, and we're looking at losing our retirement.
With Mr. Guzman even reducing his asking
Could you use
price.
the microphone?
With Mr. Guzman, even with reducing his asking price on the house, he's still having trouble getting anybody to nibble at that. So
That's
So
not
that
a,
doesn't even suggest what that evaluation is.
Right.
It just says it's got to be that or lower.
that's not a surprise. I mean, you've all heard about the Nelson farm. They've been trying to sell their farm for more than 10 years. And as soon as anybody got an inkling that this was before the project was approved and built, and they had to disclose what was going on, their buyers just backed out. I mean, that's why they were in such a dilemma.
It's just a note that they finally did find a buyer, Green Mountain Power.
Well, and that actually was a rather, it was an extremely difficult thing for them to do, and it was the result of litigation that came about over a property dispute. Yes, Josh?
My name is David Reed. I live in Warren and serve on the Warren Conservation Commission. Our Planning Commission has charged us with giving them input on the energy portion of the plan, which we're working on. The question I have is, would it be a benefit to the towns? There's 5 towns in the Mad River Valley that all enjoy the resources of the Northfield Ridge. Would there be any benefit in terms of our dealing with the Public Service Board if our town plans all had the same language?
Well, I think in terms of what the Public Service Board looks at, they look at both the regional plan and they look at the town plan and they look for consistency. So that it would be good if the town plans were consistent in terms of what everybody along the Northfield Ridge wants. In terms of having exactly the same language, I don't really think that matters because frankly, if there was a project located just in Moretown, for instance, they would look at Moretown's town plan and then they would look at the regional plan. If it was something that spans all the towns, which I think is unlikely because of Waitsfield's town plan, you can come up with your own version. This is what I've seen, for instance, I worked around the proposal, what was called the Grandpa's Knob Wind Park. That was on the Pittsford Ridge. And there are 4 towns that adjoin it. And each town changed their town plan in response to it. All 4 town select boards voted against it. 1 town voted overwhelmingly against it. And the other towns just didn't hold townwide votes, but their town select boards took positions. And each town changed the town plan in completely different ways. And I think that that's what I see in my work in communities around Vermont, is that every town has its own personality. I didn't get into telling them what to say. They asked me for examples, and I sent them town plans from around the state where the towns had grappled with these issues. Some of them did it very easily. Some of them had real, it was like, this is zoning, and we have to allow some uses on ridge lines. And so I think that what you're talking about is, it's certainly good to be aware of what's in the other town plans and have as much consistency as possible. And also, your regional plan is important because regional plans these days still tend to be fairly vague. And so trying to get more specific language in those would be helpful. But in terms of the same language, I don't really know that that's necessary. So other questions or comments?
Thank you all for this tonight. I'm Sal Stimosa from Waitsfield. I fear I'm going to reveal my naivete when I ask this question. But in light of the difficulty in erecting these wind towers in this state, the costs, the fractures that are caused in town, the regulatory oversight that's attached not only through Act 248, but also through ANR because of wetlands and such. Why do they persist? Let me take a crack at it. I may have a follow-up, so depending on what your answer is. Okay, I mean, if you work at all with the power industry, what you find out is it's a closed world of big money that doesn't like to be told what to do. It's very concerned about maintaining its monopoly. It's very concerned about making profits every quarter. There have been fairly generous wind tax credits, and when they can come into a state and propose a project, and we have something like Section 248, which basically effectively eliminates any real community opposition, and allows the Public Service Board to simply pass a project, overrule all the environmental criteria on just the basis that the project might conceivably, in their opinion, serve the public good, and then basically require the ratepayers here and in other places for the RECs to buy the power. They make money hand over fist. We've set up an open door. They can come in by the drove and try to set up these projects and make a lot of money. So it's no surprise at all that they'll do that. And it's a very cold, brutal kind of world. The power industry is very, kind of a ruthless, powerful industry. And just like any other major high profit center, large volume kind of corporation.
Well, I thought your answer might be money. But a lot of what you presented would indicate that there are a lot of front-end costs for them as well. I'm sure they can make that up over time. But the values, the wind values, they're not producing the electrons they might otherwise produce somewhere in the middle of Kansas. So that to me is money also. So it's a little fuzzy.
Yeah, they don't have to.
Why they persist?
Even with a low capacity factor, they get a good contract for these. It's essentially guaranteed profit, and they can write off a lot of the equipment very quickly. They make a lot of money short term off these projects. There's no, whether or not they produce at the kind of advertised level. The only reason they say the capacity factor is going to be 33% or something like that is they'd be taking a high risk of having the PSB say this is not really in the public good, if these aren't really good wind sites. So they say that. And they say there's going to be no impact on property values. And they say there's going to be no serious environmental impact. And they say that there's going to be no serious noise impact and all this stuff just to get the project approved, whether it's true or not.
Did you want to comment?
So as inhospitable an environment as this is in Vermont to these kinds of projects, there's still big money to be made.
The renewable energy industry in this state lobbied for policies to make it easy for them to do it, regardless of what we think or what the real impacts are.
Can I, Steve, before you start, can I just get my next question in? Because it goes to a point you made earlier. Do you mind?
Go for it. This is your show.
Going to your point that renewable energy production in and of itself isn't really related to the reduction of greenhouse gases. And unless there's for every electron that's generated from a wind turbine or a solar panel, if there were a commensurate reduction in that electron in some power plant in the Midwest, that would get to the issue of greenhouse gases. So if we are, as a country, and we're out on a limb here, successful in trying either to get a carbon tax, for example, to make it less financially attractive for the big fossil fuel generating companies to do business, and they start to dial down their operations, don't these wind power entities, even in Vermont, then become even more important and as a consequence more valuable? So here we are trying to do a good thing in the Midwest. Are we end up doing a bad thing here in the East?
Well, first of all, I would love a carbon tax. And I do really believe in renewable energy, and I really believe we need loads of it. I don't think we can conserve our way out of climate change. In fact, I think we need so much of it that the risk is if we do it wrongly, we're going to get nowhere close. I mean, a couple of wind farms doesn't make any difference in the Northeast. We need upwards of 1,000 to 2,000 gigawatts of renewable energy generation in the Northeast to really make a difference. And that's not going to come from wind, not even close. Well, a smidgen will only, even if you develop all the ridge lines, we need something on a much larger scale, plus a lot of conservation. But carbon tax is a good way to change the balance in the economics between renewables and drive renewables forward. But aside from that, even if you get that in place, you still need something else to guide the development around more rational lines, to protect the environment to the maximal extent possible, to get the most economic sources, and to basically really serve communities and not just the interests of big corporations. And none of that structure is in place. What we have right now is a free-for-all and basically an open door for companies to come in and try to protect their monopolies. And they don't care. The power industry doesn't care what's most appropriate for Vermont. They're not going to sit down and say, hey, well, we could really avoid the need for new transmission lines and really cut costs with a great blend of efficiency and photovoltaics and heat pumps and things like that. They're not going to do that. They're just going to come in and grab what makes the most economic profit sense for them in the short term, and they're going to ram it down our throats. And that's what they're doing.
Yeah, I'm determined to read this piece. This is a quote from a recent quote. You hear me?
Yeah.
A recent quote, actually, from Warren Buffett. You know who Warren Buffett is? Warren Buffett says, "I will do anything that is basically covered by the law to reduce Berkshire Hathaway's company tax rate." He said, for example, on wind energy, we get a tax credit if we build a lot of wind farms. That's the only reason to build them. They don't make sense without the tax credit.
So,
Money.
Sal, to give a little more depth to the money part of it, the only sort of numbers we've ever heard from the wind industry were on the IRA project, where we learned that the developer would get $30 million of profit a year. And this was a project proposed about the same size as Lowell, about 63 megawatts. Get about $30 million in profit a year, leaving $3 million in Vermont. So that includes the education tax, that includes the landowner leases, that includes the payments to the towns. So there is one school of thought that says we're not getting a very good deal. So there is a tremendous amount of money to be made, and the reason they're here is, and they have said this, and I've heard the developers say it, they're here because of the policies that you put in place. And as long as these policies are in place, where the legislature has put the policies in place, the Public Service Board says, we are just acting on what the legislature has told us to do, and if you don't like what it looks like, and this is an exact quote from the chair of the Public Service Board to the legislature, if you don't like what it looks like, then tell us by changing the law, and we will stop approving these. But I did attend a conference at Harvard Law School sponsored by the Department of Energy. It was called Facilitating Wind Energy Development, and it was all about community-based stakeholder processes. And so my organization, Vermonters for a Clean Environment, is an advocate for doing it differently. Regardless of what resource we're talking about, instead of developer-driven policy, that we as a community come together and look at what our resources are, work with the developers to determine what we build and where we build it, hire experts that we all agree on instead of the dueling experts, so that the public doesn't have to dip into their own pockets, the developer's going to pay for the experts anyway, and mutual gains negotiation, that's a term of alternative dispute resolution, where you make a better deal. And right now, we as a state are not making a very good deal on these wind projects. Robin?
Yeah, I just want to remind everybody that wind is intermittent. We still need baseload power. And if anybody has driven behind a big diesel bus or a tractor trailer, you know what happens when they let off the gas or let off the brake or step on the gas. We see big plumes of carbon going. And the same thing happens when they ramp these big energy plants up and down due to wind coming onto the grid. It's intermittent. It challenges the integrity of the grid, and there's no storage capacity. When it's off, and when it's on. It's very difficult for ISO New England to manage the grid. And that's the problem with curtailment in Lowell and Sheffield.
And that brings up a very good point, that what we have right now in New England that ramps in response to the wind are natural gas plants. The most efficient natural gas plant is in Londonderry, New Hampshire. I went there with the siting commission. I asked the CEO, so what happens when you ramp down to let the wind in? He said, my plant runs inefficiently. He's not saving fuel. He's not saving greenhouse gas emissions. And so there are what are called peaking generators, and they are trying to put some peaking generators into a plant in Salem, Massachusetts, where they're going to be building a new plant. But this is another piece that Ben didn't include in his talk about, in addition to all the new transmission that we need, we also need to replace the entire generation fleet with peaking natural gas plants to ramp efficiently in response to the wind in order to make there even be any savings. So, did you have a question?
Yes, no.
Mike?
Dave Black, Northfield. To go back earlier, I just wanted to check some of the specs. You said if all the potential for wind is utilized in the state of Vermont, you can only get the max maybe 3% of the actual use by the citizens.
Yeah, so I better be very careful and clear on this because Vermont's load is very small. It would be quite easy to generate all of Vermont's electricity either with in-state wind or with photovoltaics, or with some probably some fraction of it with some additional small hydro. It's Vermont's a drop in the bucket. Our average load is around a gigawatt, and we're minuscule. The point that I try to make is when you look at the Northeast as a whole, then that's really what needs to be addressed by state policies in the Northeast. We have to look at that whole load. That whole load is gargantuan compared to the developable wind resource in the Northeast. The only source that's even close to, well, in fact, that is actually much larger. The only local renewable energy resource that is on the same scale is solar resources on land, possibly offshore wind. Offshore wind, there's not any good evidence at this point that it's ever going to be cost effective. There's a lot of issues with putting floating turbines and things like that in the ocean and the cost of the transmission. So I see the main resource that we need to exploit is the solar.
All right. The other question I had, I just want to check my facts. I recently saw a specification somewhere like in some database. There was like proposal of close to 750 miles of bridge line and transmission line construction to achieve this 2 or 3% max.
Yeah, the power industry's already been gearing up for the last 10 years on looking at that transmission proposal that 7 to 12 billion that I referenced from Gordon Wheeleye 4 years ago. That was already after pretty extensive discussions had gone on. There's the Northern Pass line down in New Hampshire. Recently in the news here, there's been a talk about a line coming down under Champlain. There's a lot of interest in importing more hydropower from Canada. I think this is a terrible idea. I agree with you that that's a really destructive renewable energy. That's an old, inappropriate renewable energy generation source. But industry in Massachusetts, especially, and to some extent in some of the other states down there, really want a lot of cheap hydropower, and they've been railing against supporting incentives for solar power. And they want to bring a lot more hydro down. And what's happened is a kind of a synergy between the wind industry and those interests to build a system that they could export more wind energy from the region and bring down. And so ballpark estimates are about 5,000 megawatts of wind and about 3,000 megawatts additional of hydro. And that's kind of the big industry plan. Transmission guys are going to make money hand over foot, so they really want this. The utility industry, the generators like this because they'll be able to sell the power. They don't really want people generating their own power. And the industrial consumers in the South will be happy because they'll get this really cheap hydropower from Canada, paid for largely by all the rest of us, because those costs of those transmission lines are going to be socialized. I dug into some of the Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection documents on renewable energy development in the Northeast, and they're very supportive of more wind power. But I noticed that they said at one critical point that basically the economics depend on the transmission lines not getting socialized. In other words, that their consumers in Massachusetts aren't going to have to pay for that. Wind looks great to them if they don't have to pay for the transmission lines. Throwing the cost of the transmission lines, it's ridiculous.
More questions?
Thank you.
So, Annette, I sort of want to bring it back to the town plan. Is this, it's on?
Yeah,
Is it
just
on?
hold on.
Okay. Oh, I'm Karen Horn, here, I live here. And I'm on the planning commission. And something you said earlier kind of bothers me. You said that you can't say you're supportive of renewable energy and also that you don't want wind development on your ridge lines, for instance. I would like our plan to be able to say that we're supportive of reducing our carbon footprint and of renewable energy of our choosing where it's appropriate in this community. And I'm wondering how you can help us split that difference.
I think as long as you qualify it and say what it is that you do want and make sure it's consistent with other parts of your plan, it's fine to do that. Just to sort of a lot of town plans around the state, because of when the energy plan section got added and nobody had it in their plan, and all of a sudden it became a requirement. I've seen so many town plans that are basically one line: we support renewable energy. So instead, you can articulate more along the lines of what you just said and make sure that it is consistent with the natural resource section and other sections of your town plan. So it's just these sort of vague statements that I think the board does not find helpful and that can work. We have seen work against towns. So there is a lot of language that towns have created through reacting to these projects and created these consistencies between the town plans. I mean, it doesn't mean that you're saying we don't support renewable energy. You just find a way to say it that is consistent throughout your plan. Because, you know, I'm seeing, I live in Rutland County, a lot of uproar now over the solar projects. And so Rutland Town, Rutland City, they're scrambling. You know, you have the opportunity. You don't have that imminent threat with things actually being filed in the Public Service Board. So these towns that have had to react are scrambling to craft language that at least protects the values of the community while being very much in favor of building solar. And so if you are very much in favor of building wind, you still need to craft your town plan language in a way that tells the Public Service Board how it is that you want to go about it. And don't leave it up to them to guess, because they want your input. That's my take.
Can I say something on the solar? On the solar point, the figure I gave that I showed from NREL for the developable resource of solar in Vermont is around 34 gigawatts, which is a lot more than we would ever need. So there's a lot of flexibility in where you site solar. But right now, in that area, the model currently is very similar to what's happening with wind. Developer comes in from out of state. They're going to set up a project where they're going to sell the RECs out of state, and they're going to take advantage of our incentives to make it really economic. So it's not really a community-driven or even a Vermont-serving project per se. They come in and find a landowner near a power line. They don't really vet carefully for environmental stuff, except to the extent that they think they can get it through the permit process. They spring it on the neighbors, and they file it at the PSB and try to push it through. This is a terrible way to do development. What we really should be doing is we really should have some kind of mandate from the state to really tell each town, look, we really need you to develop this stuff in a sustainable way. Get together. We actually did this in the Northeast Kingdom. Get a GIS expert, map out, find the possible areas, and then start to vet them. Find the places where it is the best possible fit. Maybe not, there's always going to be impacts. There's always going to be possibly somebody annoyed by it. But there's no effort being made like that. There's no real vetting or planning process like that. It's kind of crazy. It's sort of the kind of development we need most to do at a very serious scale. We are putting the least planning in. We've just handed it over to an industry to come in and just sort of willy-nilly force it on us. And that's just creating an enormous amount of friction. I'm a big fan of solar, and I hate
those developers are making a lot of money too.
And I hate to see the controversy that's coming out of Rutland. And I would guess that some of that controversy is well-based and some of it's not. But the problem is the amount of controversy is going to be a lot greater if projects aren't well planned.
So we're going to be wrapping up soon, and we're going to come back to you. We may have to send you guys out in home. But Dennis, you want to bring? Oh, wait, one more for Sal.
Yeah, I've got to go. I'm sorry I don't mean to monopolize here, but I have one question for Ben. I sit on the select board in Waitsfield, so I deal with a lot of tangled issues. Try to listen very carefully. I'm somebody that, I'm not a scientist, but I like listening to the science side of some of these issues. And I'm always prepared to dig into it to kind of fact check on my own. You're given the science side of this, your science side.
Right.
Is there a counter-science side?
Well, it's funny because I've been putting this information out, and I think in better and better form, but I've been basically giving the same message with much of the same data for 4 years. I have never once received an email debating the kinds of
That's what I'm asking.
estimates. Never once. And a couple times I've tried to get pro-wind people to debate me and really go through all this stuff. And it doesn't happen. It seems like mostly people are mostly interested in hurling sound bites back and forth.
So then, we have been part of 2 dueling expert panels, one in Brighton and one in
Right.
Grafton.
We've done some of those kind of panels, but it's basically been always set up, and this frustrates the heck out of me. Every time it's been set up, it's like a panel where there's a moderator, and we each get 10 minutes to make our points, and we never really get to
We
debate.
never get to debate.
We never get to take, okay, what about that particular point? What about this point? And do a real, kind of didactic analysis of what's going on. And that's sad. I'll tell you, I spend as much time talking and arguing with the anti-wind side as I do on the pro-wind side, because I think that there's a lot of invalid arguments on both sides, and I really try to engage all of them. But there hasn't been a really good public forum yet, and I'm all for it if somebody wants to organize it.
Well, I will say, these kinds of forums are really excellent. They really are excellent, and I would urge you to make your way right up the valley. I forgot your name, but if you know our energy coordinator, Chris Badger, give him a call and say it's time to do one of these down in Waitsville. Go on right on down 100. I think the more face-to-face and small audiences like this, unfortunately, it's a long haul, but this may be the most effective way to get you message.
Well, the one thing that did happen at the Grafton Forum was I made my little spiel about how I've been looking for 4 years to figure out if wind turbines actually reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And on the other side was Paul Burns of Deepford, Robert Dostis of Green Mountain Power, David Wittersdorf of All Earth Renewables, and Kara Johnson of Velco. And David Wittersdorf took the question from the audience because the audience member said the opposing side made a big deal about how we're not addressing carbon with wind, and you didn't rebut it, so what's your response? And David kind of circuitously got around to say, basically, yeah, the transmission grid's old, we have to upgrade it. Nobody disagreed with it. There they had the perfect opportunity, they chose not to grapple with it in the rebuttal phase, and then when they were asked directly, nobody said, she's wrong. So for me, that was a pretty telling moment.
It was interesting at that same debate, the ISO guy, Kara Johnson, said, we love solar. Because the ISO people, because some parts of the utility industry that aren't working on the generation side don't mind solar because it's really well correlated with the load.
So this is done based on Department of Public Service numbers, and it shows how well solar matches our load and how poorly wind matches our load. And those are equivalencies that were done. So back to you.
I do have a burning question. I think in part, I feel like there was a slight mischaracterization of my argument as being, since we've done it in the past, we can do it in the future. So maybe I'd like to reframe that a little bit. You as an advocate of solar, and me as somebody who has in the process of installing solar, where are these solar panels being manufactured? In an industrial facility that's displacing some land base, being manufactured with resources which are mined from some other site at some place else. And somebody is making a huge profit in the process, and the reason they're manufacturing them is to make a profit.
Right. I don't even think necessarily needing to make a profit is a bad thing. It's just that if the desire to make a profit ends up causing people to make very destructive choices or inappropriate choices, then that profit motive serves a bad thing. But the profit motive can serve an equally good thing. As far as where panels are manufactured, the United States used to have the lead in solar panel manufacturing. We had lousy support for it. Eventually the Chinese gained the lead, then the Taiwanese and some other countries. We're actually right now, we're a little bit more in a growth phase, and I would love to see it manufactured mostly in the U.S. It'd be nice to have it as locally as possible. If you don't do the manufacturing process correctly, there are organic solvents and other things that can be dumped. There's been terrible problems with that in China, no doubt about that. On the energy payback side, though, photovoltaics do pay back. They have a really good ROI or ROI on investment, energy-wise. Actually, arguably, so do wind turbines if you don't put the transmission stuff in it. They're both not too bad in that sense. But my main point on the solar is we've got a 3 orders of magnitude larger solar resource here than we have a wind resource. We have much better technological innovation, much better economics on it, much better environmental impact. Why the heck would we be looking at doing enormous destruction to the ridges when we have another option like that?
And if you wanted to get sort of excited about solar, read Technology Review magazine. It's the magazine of MIT. And every month there's some latest and greatest breakthrough in solar. We don't see that with wind, but there is some hope that the processes are better. Wind turbines now, because the gearboxes are failing, only last 5 to 7 years they've gone to direct drive magnets. Well, those magnet generators are using a lot of rare earth minerals that are mined in China in incredibly toxic ways. So I'd like to let you guys continue this afterwards, and thank you all for coming.
We had one question.
Sure.
I'm for going longer if you'd like.
Well, that's up to you guys. So we've gone 2 hours.
Mr. Brown? Yeah. Scott Manning, Northfield. I'm just curious, you're installing solar panels. If the wind turbines did get implemented, would you do away with the solar panels?
No, absolutely not.
No. So, in other words, all the other people which side of the mountain do you live on? The east side or the west side?
East side.
East side?
Yeah.
Well, you're going to be affected by the strobe effect.
I'm fully aware of the impacts, and I think I pointed that out. I have no personal individual gain to be had by the installation of industrial wind in my backyard. None. And yet I have a disproportionate impact due to proximity to them. And I support it. That's my point. That is my point.
So I respect that, and you know, having been a very strong advocate of wind and still an advocate for the right places, I understand where you're coming from, and there may be people willing to sacrifice for that. It would be interesting to see how you feel about it later on after you've lived with it for a while and seen more of how the two industries develop. You mentioned something about the zealousness aspect, and I certainly didn't mean to, and I don't think any of us meant to say that we think you're a zealot or something like that. But I'll tell you, for those of us that have been involved in opposing wind, we have been just showered in the most over-the-top, nasty kind of response that you can imagine. And I think it's a natural thing because people who are very supportive of wind view it as, you know, this incredibly important thing for saving the planet, and then somebody comes along and is criticizing it. And people's initial reaction usually, when they're in that position, is usually rage. And they don't usually hold, when they really think they're right, they usually don't hold anything back. And so there really is a problem with this. And I would offer to you that it's not just on the the pro-wind side. There's people that can be equally nasty and inappropriate on the anti-wind side. And I've personally gotten that back too, because I'll stand up and say, I do think there's a place for these in the energy mix. And a lot of the anti-wind people are, frankly, some of them at least are anti-renewables in general and hate my stance on solar too. And I get that from them too. So this is a tough game.
I would just like to say that in this state, we're getting really bad leadership on this issue. This is the biggest issue in my mind.
Can you use the microphone?
Just hold it up close.
Yeah, that's louder than you think. Hold it right up to your focus.
I've just seen some of the act in Montpelier by the governor, by representatives, senators, who are hook, line, and sinker for this type of energy. And it doesn't make any sense when you hear all the facts, and it doesn't play. And I wonder, our only choice there is to vote these people out. You know, and you have to ask your representatives for your town their feelings on this, and then vote them out when they stand for industrial scale wind. It's a boondoggle, and there are better choices. And for some reason, they're walking this plank. I don't know why.
Well, I've been curious myself. One thing that I can attest to is that for years, the wind industry really lobbied the legislators, and frankly, I was in favor of wind energy 10 years ago. I saw the Searsburg turbines. I thought they were beautiful. They're 197 feet tall. The Lowell turbines are 459 feet tall. And so there were a lot of us who back in 2000, 2001, 2002, 2003 supported Searsburg type turbines. And I think we all thought, you know, a cluster of them here, a cluster of them there. And so that's, I think, what we're dealing with in the legislature. That was not. The response was, we don't have time to waste, and we have to do everything. And Chittenden County, of course, doesn't have the wind resource that your town has, or that exists in Northeast Kingdom, and so that's part of it. It's sort of, instead of NIMBY, I call it YB, yes, in your backyard.
On that point, say something about the economics of this, which is interesting. When I was advocating in New Mexico, I got a program through the legislature and through the regulatory commission there that allowed utilities, in fact required utilities to pay PV system owners 13 cents a kilowatt hour to buy the renewable energy credit if the owner agreed, and then the utility could count that towards the renewable energy standard. And that was the first policy we got in place. We had a legitimate renewable energy standard. Vermont does not have that. Vermont has a fake target where they can sell the RECs out of state. But we set that up. It was 13 cents a kilowatt hour that has to be paid for by other ratepayers. This is when solar was, the modules were $5, $6 a watt at least. In 1 year, we increased the rate of solar installation 1,000%. That was for 13 cents a kilowatt hour. The speed program in Vermont, more recently, was passed for like 27 cents a kilowatt hour. This is money that goes directly to a developer to build projects that are not net metered, are not at load.
It's the standard offer program.
It's the standard offer program. I testified at the state legislature suggesting, instead of doing that, why don't you just incent people to do this themselves? It works great. Look, we have great examples. And immediately I found out, sorry, we don't even recognize the renewable energy credits towards the state targets to begin with. Shortly following that, I don't know if I had something to do with it or not, they decided to do the solar adder, which GMP had a version of, and then they put that into state law, so that we got something like that. But still, they were still not counting the RECs, and now they're shifting in the new legislation to actually doing this, I think, although we still don't have a valid renewable portfolio standard. But anyways, to make a long story short, there's a much cheaper way to do this if you incent people like that and put the incentive on top of that metering. And today, I think we could be offering people something like 5 cents a kilowatt hour, and we would drive solar development like gangbusters at a fifth of the cost that we're paying through the speed program for other stuff, and about a third of the cost that we're paying for wind. And so there's some very obvious stuff there, but the problem is this doesn't, that my proposal was treated as a threat to the developers who wanted to come into the state and who were dominating REV, and the wind developers who were dominating REV, so it didn't get any traction.
So I think we should probably wrap it up unless there's any other burning questions.
So I just want to say a big thank you to our speakers who came tonight, and for everyone coming out and joining this forum. This is obviously an important topic, and I look forward to future discussions on it, dialogue. As I mentioned, there's a place to sign up if you want to be part of, I believe it's additional information or email on this topic, so feel free to do that. And thank you again for coming out tonight. Appreciate it.
Thank you.